Well, welcome everybody. I'm excited to be here and have this great topic. So I'm going to start with some slides about the overall series. Okay, so this is our second session this academic year. We're focusing today on selecting therapies to improve upper extremity function, and we're excited to have Michelle Ballasiotes and Todd Levy here to share with us their lived experience and expertise, both of them. So as you know, when there's a stroke early in life, it affects the whole lifespan. And while we show these pictures of the campus of Mass General and Spalding, we know that a lot happens outside the medical setting. We remind you that these webinars are for educational and informational purposes. If you're seeking specific guidance for your medical situation, you need to work with your own healthcare providers. And we ask that when we get to the question and answer section of this webinar, that you keep that in mind and that if you can ask questions in a general way so that it remains educational, it'll best serve everyone. We've been running these educational series since 2019, so we've been at it a while, 6 years. We have more than 50 sessions, all curated up on YouTube. This session will be up on YouTube within about a week, and we reach an international audience. We collaborate with colleagues and families from around the world, and we're really excited to have today's speakers. Just so you have the context of what's currently planned, we had an exciting session just 2 weeks ago about team impact. I'll encourage you to go watch that on our YouTube channel. And you see today we're selecting therapies to improve upper extremity function. And then we have a few more webinars scheduled. We may add sessions in April and May as well. And our annual in-person session is scheduled for May 10th, so please save the date for that. I will put links in the chat, both for how to find us, as well as some resources that Todd has sent me to share with you, either in the chat or if they don't work in the chat, we will send them out in a follow-up email. So I'm going to stop my share. And I didn't introduce myself. I'm Mara Yale. I lead this educational series in the Pediatric Stroke and Brain Injury Education Program. I am also mom to two teenagers. The younger one is 15 and had a stroke at birth. And I'm super excited now to hand it off to Michelle, who's going to share about her lived experience as well as her experience as an occupational therapist.
Thanks, Mara. So as Mara said, my name is Michelle Ballasiotes, and so I'm here not only as a pediatric occupational therapist, but as someone who has lived experience with hemiplegia. And my apologies if I sound a little hoarse. Working in pediatrics, it's easy to get sick, so I think I might be coming down with something. Um, but working with kids who have hemiplegia on my caseload, it really feels like it's coming full circle for me because I've been in their shoes and then now I get to help them navigate their own journey. And my own therapy journey, it started relatively early when I was 6 months old, and it continued until I was about 10 years old. Uh, Back then, Todd's going to touch more on this later, but constraint induced movement therapy, it wasn't widely known or used. So my mom jokes that even if it was more known when I was a kid, that I would have been too stubborn to even participate in it. And honestly, she's probably right. So, what I'd like to do today is to walk you through a timeline of my life and weave in some of the different types of therapies that Todd's going to go into more later. So, I'll start at the beginning. And although obviously I don't remember the earliest days, my mom would tell me stories about how she encouraged me to use my affected hand. And I worked with a therapist when I was a toddler, and it was almost like a modified CIMT. I always remember about how this one therapist was trying to get me to eat a Cheerio from my affected hand. And I was a toddler. And so my way of telling her, nope, not happening, is I bit her. So sorry about that. But I know that she was definitely trying to work on the foundational skills of reaching, grasping, releasing, and just strengthening my shoulder. Um, Now, as an OT, I do use similar strategies with my own patients. I have a 15-month-old who I work with. Um, and sometimes for him, I'll put a tube sock over his dominant hand, and that encourages him a little bit more to try and use his affected hand. He'll still try to cheat a little bit, but I think that visual um, kind of helps him a little bit. And then at that young age, the same way my own therapist did when I was growing up, my main goal is to focus on play and creating low stress environments. So a lot of baby toys already work on those foundational grasp and release skills. One of the most important things that I like to tell my families of young children is that the repetition really is key. And my mom, who I should mention is on this call today, and definitely didn't tell me to say this, she does deserve a shout out. She was one of my biggest cheerleaders growing up. I I have lots of memories of her telling me, use righty, don't forget. Feels like she said it a million times a day, but she really did know how to balance encouragement with patience. And I think that's why I still have positive memories of my childhood and everything from growing up. And the reason she did that is because the reality is that therapy isn't enough on its own. Progress comes from weaving those principles in your everyday life and practicing what your therapist discusses with you at home. Another tip I like to give families is to kind of trick them into using both hands. So I'll give them toys that require you to use two hands almost. So little kids, they love to catch things. So I'll give them a ball that's a bit bigger. And so you can't catch it with one hand, you need to use two hands. And that's been pretty successful with a lot of my patients and getting them to really think about bringing both hands together. And it's also critical to set kids up for success. In OT school, I remember learning about the concept of the just right challenge. And so that basically means you don't want the task to be so easy that it's boring for the kids, but it also shouldn't be so hard that they really feel like it's impossible. And they really need to feel a sense of accomplishment to be motivated. And my therapist growing up, they were really, really good at this for me. And they built rapport with me. They adjusted the activities to match my ability. And it was in a fun and creative way. And so it felt like all I was doing was playing with them. When I was younger, the therapy mostly focused on crafts and cutting and dressing skills and stuff like that. We worked on a mixture of one-handed and two-handed tasks, and those really built the foundational skills that I needed to become an independent adult. And I know that even though it felt like play, I was learning how to navigate life and do all those things that many of us just take for granted, or it comes more naturally to us. As I got older, therapy became more goal oriented. My therapist, they encouraged me to use, oh, sorry if you see the dog to the side of me. Um, my therapist encouraged me to use two hands more at first and kind of try it out that way before we reverted more to an adapted one-handed method. So I did end up learning how to put on a necklace with two hands. And then I also pull my hair back with two hands as well. But when that really wasn't an option, or we figured out I just don't have those motor patterns to really help me do it, I use one hand for things like buttoning a shirt, or I use an adaptive can opener if I can help it, because being a right hemi doesn't help anything because the world is made for right-handed people. And so regular can openers don't work. It's just much easier just to hit a button and do it that way. But all that to say is that I wouldn't be where I am today without all of my incredible therapists, and especially the OT I worked with from the ages about 6 to 10 years old. she really helped me find independence, and she gave me the confidence to pursue anything I wanted. Um, as she taught me how to drive almost. I drove with her before I drove with my mom. And that's something I love to remember. Uh, and today, as a pediatric OT, my goal is to provide that same supportive, creative, and fun environment for my own patients. Therapy, for me, the biggest takeaway is that it isn't just about improving function. It's about helping kids discover their potential and really show them what they're capable of. And that's why this work matters to me so much because I've lived it and it's been awesome to see their faces when they do something they never thought they would be able to do. So, thank you guys for letting me share my story and a little bit about my background. Hopefully, it gives you a glimpse into the incredible power of therapy and the impact that a therapist might have on your child's life. So, now I'm going to pass it off to Todd, and he's going to go more into the science and types of therapies behind it all.
Michelle. It's really incredible to have your perspective and to hear, particularly about the balance that you struck. I think that's incredibly interesting and important for us as professionals to think about as well, and certainly for parents to think about. Um, Hang with me for 1 second here while I find the view that I need. Okay, thanks. So I'm going to talk about selecting therapies to improve upper extremity function following stroke. And as you'll see soon, it's a little bit more broad than stroke as well. Just quick disclaimers. Unfortunately, I have no financial disclosures. um, I am drawing upon scientific research, and navigating that and interpreting that is certainly tricky and subject to bias. So there's that. Different ways to interpret things. And last but not least, the talk is not meant to prescribe any particular interventions for any particular specific individual. So that's just something to keep in mind. I am going to focus on information you can use today together with your teams to select good interventions. So hopefully by the end of the talk, my hope is that you, the participants, will be able to identify common themes in interventions that have the strongest scientific support, common themes in interventions that have been proven ineffective. Now there's enough research to show some of the things that actually really don't help most people. And then effective therapy doses and scheduling strategies. So dose is really just the amount of therapy that includes not only what you're doing with the therapist, but also the practice that you're getting in between visits. And scheduling is about, well, how do you schedule that practice? Is it every day? Is it once a week? Is it 3 times a week? So I'm going to share a little bit about that dosing and scheduling. And finally, and definitely not leastly, because this is such a big topic, my main objective for today is that you guys will feel comfortable using some reference papers that are kinds of decision aids that you can always go back to when it's time for the next course of care or you're thinking about how to write goals. And they're decision aids for patients, caregivers, together with the therapist and physicians in some cases, to help decide what is next, what's the next strategy for us. Who does this talk cover? It's really rather broad for pediatric brain injury. That can be brain injury that happens before birth, during the birth process, or shortly after birth. It also does pertain to childhood stroke, so situations where the stroke happens later on in childhood, far after birth. But as a caveat, most of the research I'm talking about today directly pertains to injury around the perinatal period. But if you have had a stroke in childhood, this information, I believe, does pertain to you once your disabilities are chronic. And there is really, I don't think that there's really a consensus around, well, what is it? When does it go from the acute phase to the chronic phase? I'm going to be more sort of on the conservative side and say that's about a year after injury. Probably even more important than just that time period is when does it seem like the spontaneous recovery or recovery with therapy is really slowed down. It's not really happening like rapidly like it did in the first bunch of weeks, bunch of months. And that could be 6 months, it could be 9 months, it could be 3 months. So I'm going to say a year. So if you had that injury in and around the time of childbirth, this information is very specific to you. If it's a childhood stroke, if it's been more than a year, it's applicable. And then last but not least, most of this research that we have that I'm going to talk about comes from studies of children with cerebral palsy. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means. CP is a group of physical disabilities. It's a very broad umbrella term for a group of physical disabilities that are caused by a variety of types of brain injury that happens before, during, or shortly after birth. That includes stroke. So perinatal stroke is just one of the many types of brain injuries that is included in this term cerebral palsy or CP. Perinatal stroke is actually the number one cause, it's the leading cause of unilateral cerebral palsy or UCP. This is cerebral palsy that affects one side of the body. Many of you might know this as hemiparesis. UCP, unilateral CP, the reason why I bring up this term is hopefully not to confuse you, but because this is a really important search term for professionals and consumers, because the vast majority of the research that pertains to pediatric stroke falls under this term of unilateral cerebral palsy. So you'll find more information here on pediatric stroke that at least pertains to pediatric stroke rehab, but doesn't come up when you search pediatric stroke. On the one hand, it is kind of unfortunate that I can tell you if any particular type of rehab therapy is better for your specific type of brain injury. Stroke, type of stroke, other type of brain injury that's not a stroke. There's numerous reasons for that. One of the big reasons is that OTs and PTs were generally focused on problems as opposed to the underlying injury or mechanism of injury. And just the research is not there for that precision type of approach that we're starting to see for like cancer, where they could look at the genes, the genetics of your particular, not only you as a person, but your particular tumor, and then custom tailor interventions based on that kind of precision. We just don't have that yet. Although that is, I think you can, it's reasonable to say, well, that is not great, and we should try and fix that, which I think people are. There is some good news. I think the positive way to look at that is that there's more research there's more rehab research for CP than maybe any other type of childhood disability. And that research really seems to be applicable to pediatric stroke. So we can use that research. And I think that research can help children with either one-handed or two-handed impairments. So some kids with stroke will actually have impairments of both hands. And I think this applies to them as well, even though most of that research is really about this unilateral cerebral palsy or hemiparesis. So effective therapy, one of the big themes of the research, starts with great goals. How do you write great goals? Well, caregivers and children should take part in setting goals very actively. They should be very actively a part of that process. A colleague of mine, Megan Metzler, who was working in Adam Curtin's lab at the time in Alberta, did a nice little study that demonstrated that, hey, a lot of kids with stroke can come up with very, very appropriate, reasonable goals. They're not going to just come up with like weird fantasy things. They come up with some good goals. They can do this. They can participate in goal setting. The goals must be motivating. Really important. If you can kind of just imagine yourself trying to learn a new set of skills, maybe it's like, hey, I want to learn how to play piano, but you decide, wow, I really don't like the piano lessons. How good are you going to get if you're not practicing and you're not motivated by it, right? Unfortunately, that is the way it goes. Now, fortunately, there are ways to build motivation, right? Reward systems and all kinds of things. But if you don't have a motivating goal, you got to back up and think about that. So some tips for writing goals. I think for caregivers, this really starts with before, ideally it starts with before you come in front of us for an evaluation. Um, Keep a little journal, a list, whatever kind of works for you. Doesn't have to be anything fancy whatsoever. But as things come up in real life, like what's bothersome, what do you think, what do you wish could be better, and try to get a little bit creative. I think it's easier to do in the moment. So, like, do you just wish the morning routine was quicker? Like maybe your child is using two hands to dress themselves, but it's so slow. And who has time in the morning for that? Um, does your child maybe really doesn't mind that you're helping them with putting on their hoodie, but you do know that they kind of want privacy to put their underwear on? Okay, maybe that's a motivating goal relating to self-care. And it's hard to sometimes find motivating self-care goals for at least for younger children. Um, and then things that would benefit you as a caregiver in terms of quality of life, like could you get another 15 minutes of sleep if only your child could wake up in the morning, get out of bed, and make themselves a bowl of cereal? That could be a great goal for a kid. Kids like to make themselves a bowl of cereal. A lot of kids find that motivating. Then the other place to kind of look for ideas is hobbies, sports, and all kinds of hobbies, extracurricular activities. Perhaps your child wants to shoot a basketball and dribble using both hands. Um, Different way to look at it. Perhaps your family, what you value is participation. You don't necessarily care if it's one hand or two hands. You just right now you're valuing being able to participate, keep up with their friends or siblings in the yard. So maybe it doesn't necessarily matter if it's one-handed or two. That's really good information for the OT to know, because there's different specific types of therapy that we can use to tackle that goal as opposed to the using two hands to shoot a basketball goal. Um, Maybe your child is into hairstyling. Well, can they put their own hair into a ponytail? Can they braid their siblings' hair or their friend's hair? Maybe that's an area that you could talk to the OT about. Can we make a goal for the next course of care based on that? Um, another tip for looking at goals is to be specific in terms of like what is it that you're really trying to improve. So the goals should look on paper like what you're trying to improve. So if you're trying to improve an activity, your child's participation in an activity, the goal should look like it's talking about an activity. So for example, Quinn should shoot 5 foul shots using two hands. It's pretty measurable. It's about what you're trying to do. And in this case, it includes using two hands because that's the motivating thing. The family wants to do this using two hands. Or if it's about an activity like playing basketball or dressing, the goal can look like a skill. What are skills? Skills are things like grasping, holding, pushing, pulling, manipulation. There's a bunch of different manipulation skills. So examples would look like Quinn will hold objects overhead using two hands for 10 seconds at a time. Holding is a skill. In this case, it might be a skill related to shooting a basketball. It's not exactly shooting a basketball, but it's a skill that's related to the basketball. So we'll talk a little bit more about therapies that are aimed at directly tackling the activity and those that are focused on the skills. Other examples of these activity or skill types of goals. Alex will put crew socks on in less than 30 seconds. Casey will type 30 words per minute. Charlie will grasp objects from the tabletop using her left hand. A little bit differently, if you're really interested in working on improving movement or strength, then the goal should look like it's tackling movement or strength. So examples, Dakota will increase grip strength to 10 pounds of pressure. Emery will increase active elbow flexion to 100 degrees. The reason why if you're trying to improve strength or movement, the goal should look like it's working on strength and movement. And if you're trying to improve activity or skill, it should look like the activity or skill, is because, and probably unfortunately, our therapies, the research tells us, is just not good at improving both at the same time, strength or range of motion and skills and participation. And I think when you actually think about it a lot, it's not super surprising. So in Dakota's example, say we wanted to increase her grip strength in order to open a twist top, to open a bottle of water. Well, you can increase your grip strength, but still not be able to open that top of water because there's lots of other things that go into opening up a bottle of water besides grip strength. And maybe a little bit more relatable, if you're, say you're a novice swimmer and you want to become a great swimmer, but you're not even a good swimmer yet. You're a novice swimmer. If you just go into the gym and work on strength or stretching, are you really going to become a great swimmer? No, like it's intuitive, right? You're going to have to get it in the pool and really get repetitions of the swimming strokes to become a great swimmer, right? Maybe if you're already a very good swimmer, then you can see like enhanced results by going into the gym and working on strength, because you have the skill already, right? So now let's get into selecting therapies. You do have choices. So a lot of it, I think, fortunately, is about what works for your family at any sort of given moment when you're thinking about a burst of therapy. And what I want to help you do is use the research to help you decide. And that should always happen. I think if you don't hear or see the research with your team, you should demand it. And it should be more than just like, hey, here's this one new study about like this new device, and I want to use this new device with you. We're at the stage where I'm going to show you research that's looking at multiple randomized controlled trials and then making decisions based off of that, in most cases. So where do you find this research? Again, unilateral CP is a big search term. This is a paper that comes from what's called the Cochrane Library. Cochrane, what they do is they do very, very large systematic reviews. They're done by experts. They're done by experts who don't have a financial stake in what they're reviewing. They're known for very high quality reviews. You don't have to pay to get access to these reviews. And they also have layperson summaries of all of the reviews that they publish. They're mostly medical, but there are probably a few dozen that are related to rehab, including CP. And I want to start, coincidentally, this is a Cochrane review on this idea of using decision aids, or literature on how to use research to help patients decide on their decisions about their treatments. So in this case, they looked at over 100 randomized controlled trials involving over 30,000 adults. This is adults who were facing medical decisions, either about treatments or about screening tests. So these patients were given some kind of decision aid, which are things like I'm going to show you today, either pamphlets or papers or like electronic educational kinds of tools for the patient to help them understand what their condition is, what their options are. And then they ask them questions about was it helpful or not helpful in helping you make decisions. So what they found is that in their study, these decision aids led to improved knowledge and understanding of their conditions and the treatments and options that were being given to them by their physicians. And then it improved patient-clinician communication. So it wasn't necessarily just like, oh, hey, I don't have time for you, so like just go read this. It actually was like, oh, hey, I've read this, and now I can ask you better questions, and we can have a better discussion. Patients also felt like they were better able to make decisions based on their own personal values. I thought that was really interesting. So it wasn't just like they were, being like sort of like pushed into something. They felt like they were more empowered to make decisions based off of their own values, and that they felt more confident in their decision making. So this is the first decision aid that I'd like to share with you today. It's in your handout. It's free to access. And this is a paper that I wrote together with my colleague, Brian Hoare in Australia. He's done excellent, not only research, but what we call like this decision aid work, like around knowledge, translating the knowledge for CP into everyday care. So therapy choices for children with difficulties using one hand after brain injury. We really wanted it to be, we thought that, it was about much more than stroke or even CP. The research really pertains very, very broadly. This is a table from that study. I want to spend just a couple of minutes showing you. This is one of my super cute patients in our stroke clinic, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and it was a really funny moment because you can't tell from this picture, but this 10-month-old actually had a really pretty severe right paresis where she wasn't using her right hand like at all around this time, and I went to hand the paper to her father, and she grabbed it and started playing with it using two hands. And um, her parents and I we were cracking up because the paper was about how to use two hands. And we were talking about how she never uses two hands. And at the end of the visit, her father said, "Hey, do you have any more literature for my baby?" So, no, I don't think the paper was magical. But the baby was probably the only person who's ever read my paper. Maybe it actually worked. I don't know. But anyway, this is sort of like what this paper looks like. It describes in some detail three different types of very high quality interventions based on research: constraint-induced movement therapy, or CIMT. And then it describes that briefly. It's a skill-based therapy, so it's trying to improve skills as opposed to directly trying to improve something like strength or range of motion. The child puts on a glove, a mitt, or a cast on the hand that they prefer to use, and then do lots of practice with the hand they do not like to use. And it says right here, the activities must motivate the child. And then I'll talk about the last column in a minute. I'll go back to that. Bimanual therapy, next one down, and it's not like second best, it just happens to be second one down, or BMT, bimanual therapy. It also is skill-based therapy, so it's very similar to constraint-induced movement therapy in that we're trying to improve skills. In this case, direct practice of using two hands together. Again, the activities must motivate your child. And then the one at the bottom here, and it's not because it's less effective, is called goal-directed training or goal-directed practice. And it is practice directly relating to an important activity, such as putting on a t-shirt, could be shooting a basketball. And through practice, your child learns how they can do this activity in their own way, or the child and the therapist work together to come up with like the most efficient way. Might be one hand, might be two, they might use a tool. And so now I'll come back to this final comment, this final column. How many hours of practice does my child need? This is the dose of therapy, right? It's kind of a weird term, dose, when it comes to therapy, but we're getting there with the research and being able to look at the dose. So these numbers are not perfect in that they're not like the research directly compared 40 hours versus 60 hours versus 10 hours. It really was like putting lots of different studies together and then using statistics to give us like what's the best we can tell, like where. So, but it gives us a sense of the dose. And for these skill-based therapies where you're trying to improve a skill, it's at least 30 to 40 hours of practice. But that's not all direct therapy. It's also practice outside of therapy. Michelle talked about this importance of practicing outside of the therapy session. So that's kind of a lot. And I think that's on the low side once you get into school age. I think it's more like 60 hours once you're school age. But it gives us like a ballpark idea. Now, this goal-directed training, where you're doing like the most efficient strategy, it's not necessarily trying to improve hand skills. It's a lower dose that's required. It's more like 14 to 25 hours. And I think it's really, in my experience, on the lower side, particularly if your child has some cognitive strengths that are related to the goals, that really support the goals. It's probably more like 14 hours per goal. And so that's a different like level of intensity. And that's a good thing to realize. The next handful of papers I want to talk about are these traffic light reviews of the research. The first two are written for professionals. there is a parent version that I'm going to show you a picture of, and that's also free. Even the professional versions here are free. Um, but I want to talk to you about both of them. Some parents might find it helpful to look at the professional ones or to look at those together with their teams. Um, and what they are is they're really meant to be tools for rapid and shared decision making between the caregiver and the therapist to decide on which interventions to use. The one on the left is specific for cerebral palsy and not necessarily specific to OT. The one on the right is very specific to OT, and it covers all kinds of disabilities that OTs work with, CP being one of them, and then also others. And these reviews look mostly at other reviews. So they're reviews of reviews. That's how much research we have now. It's quite a bit. Um, they're looking mostly at randomized controlled trials. They are much smaller than like drug randomized controlled trials. So instead of hundreds of people in these randomized controlled trials, they're like 20 or 30 kids each. But that's like the best we have in rehab. So this is like good research for rehab. Um, and not only do they look at, well, how much of an effect do these therapies have on our outcome measures? They also look kind of beyond that to like risk versus benefits, and not only like risk of like harm, but risk of like, is it going to take so much time? Is it really not aligned with people's values? They talk to consumers about what do you value. So they're considering things not just about the effect of the treatment, but like what consumers value. And they illustrate not only what works, but also what doesn't work. This comes from the parent version of the CP traffic light review. And, I don't have enough time to go through the full paper in detail, but this is like, meant for you guys to be able to go through on your own and be able to read pretty easily. And they use this traffic light system. So green is like, go. It means high quality evidence indicates that this treatment by manual therapy, goal directed therapy, whatever it is do it. It's green light. You can feel pretty good about it. That being said, even our best therapies, the research shows that they don't work for everyone. So it could be that it doesn't work for you, but odds are it probably will. Then there's two kinds of shades of yellow, and that's somewhere in the middle. There's strong yellow, and that they interpret that as being probably do it. There's promising evidence suggesting possible effectiveness. Or there's weak yellow light. There's no research or conflicting findings. And then there's red light, which actually means studies actually show it doesn't work. So you probably shouldn't do this. Or in a few cases, they actually show harm. Their sort of like general findings is that they looked at 398 outcomes, and they found that 54 of the interventions that qualified to be like looked at in this systematic review were green light. 264 were in this kind of high yellow, probably do it. 68 were that lower yellow, meaning probably don't do it. Maybe you've tried some of the ones that were green and you're like, well, they didn't work, so maybe now you try those. And then 12 were in this don't do it red light. This is just one little snapshot of what the paper looks like when you go through in more detail. You can look at what is the outcome? If you're interested in improving self-care, well, there's a green light intervention for goal-directed training. That's that direct practicing of the goal. Could be one-handed, could be two-handed. There's a method called co-op. Some of the OTs on the line might know what that is. It's a relatively new intervention where the child does a lot of self-problem solving through strategizing. They even talk about parent outcomes, reduce stress for parents. There's actually research that shows what reduces stress for caregivers. So lots of different kinds of outcomes, and then the interventions that are green light or yellow light or red light for those. Don't feel like you have to look at this right now in any detail. This is a figure from the professional version of the traffic light diagram on CP. And I wanted to show you what this looks like. There's lots of different treatments and lots of different ways to look at it. And my next few slides will talk about what are the themes of the green lights, or like the high yellows, the greens and the high yellows? What are the themes? Because I think there are pretty clear themes, and there are others besides me that are coming away with these themes when they look at these details. So let's talk about some of those themes now. When we're looking at trying to improve movement or strength, not necessarily skill or participation, right? Therapy directly applies and directly tackles movement or strength. So if you're trying to improve passive range of motion, how much I can move the child's elbow, things that stretch, like it's a direct intervention of the problem, directly tackling the problem. Serial casting, some of you might know, you put a cast on in that position of stretch, and then every 3 to 7 days, take it off, and you see, oh, did we get more range of motion? Yep. Do we want to get even more? You put another cast on now as the tissues have loosened up or even lengthened, they actually grow. And then you progressively help those soft tissues grow. Strength training, the research shows strength training works to improve strength. Not necessarily a skill, but it does improve strength. And this is in CP and in other conditions as well. Things like Botox plus OT to improve spasticity and movement. Another big theme of all this research is that there's a clear endpoint of therapy. You're not in therapy all the time. Now, themes to improve therapy when the goal is to improve skills or participation in the activity. The goals are personal and very, very closely related to real life activities. The goals and the therapy, the interventions involves lots of practice of those skills or direct practice of that activity. Another big theme is that the child is self-generating movements, meaning they're thinking about how to move and then doing it and practicing that, as opposed to me or you as the caregiver doing a lot of movement for the child. So thinking and doing, the child thinking and doing really is a big theme. That's my big takeaway from looking at the themes of these most efficacious studies. And again, there's a clear endpoint. So I want to talk a little bit more about this thinking and doing. If you look at these three different pictures and you ask, how would I pick up the coffee cup if I'm going to take a drink? Think about that for a second. You would probably pick the third from the right, maybe the one in the middle. If you pick the first one, you'd have to either adjust the position of the cup in your hand once it's in the air, using a second hand to turn it around so the spout was facing your mouth, or you'd have to kind of do something awkward to get to the spout. And that would be less efficient. It would be awkward. Your other hand might have a telephone in it or something else in it, right? So you probably wouldn't do that. You don't think about that because this is something that you do every day, over and over and over again. It doesn't take a lot of thought. It's automatic. But somewhere in your brain, there's processing going on. That processing that happens before carrying out that movement, that sequence of movements to carry out the action, is therapists will call that motor planning. Your brain's coming up with a plan to move, and it's automatic for everyday tasks like this. Now imagine if you've never done this before, or imagine you're asking your child to do something they've never done before, or you're asking them to do something with a hand they've never done before, or in a different way than they've ever done before. They're going to have to think about it, right? Motor planning. There's a really interesting line of research in kids with cerebral palsy. A number of studies have taken kids with unilateral CP. They look like they just have problems with their muscles on one side of their body, and they test just their ability to motor plan. And they test that ability to motor plan using the hand that's difficult for them to use. Then they test it using the hand that's not so difficult for them to use, their dominant hands. They find motor planning problems with either hand. So there's something going on that has nothing directly to do with movement or the muscles, something in the brain that has to do with the thinking process. So if you think about that, it makes a lot of sense that if you're trying to improve two-hand skills, the therapies that are showing that the research is demonstrating, hey, these therapies work, they involve thinking and doing. So it's kind of no surprise. And then the therapies that are just focused on movement, stretching, strengthening, they don't necessarily result in improved skills, right? That makes sense. So what are these therapies that involve thinking and doing? What do they look like? Hopefully these videos will show what will play. This is my buddy Harvey. He's a 7-year-old with right hemiparesis from a perinatal stroke. He's got difficulty moving his right side. These are some videos of him in my intensive bimanual therapy program. In the first video here, he's directly practicing his goal of putting on his socks. And see how fast my patients move? No, I'm just kidding. So this is at twice the speed. So he's just directly practicing that skill, right? His goal is to improve his participation in this activity. So we're practicing that activity. And strategically, but it's also very obvious in that we want to get better at this, so we're practicing this. What we're not doing is we're not saying, oh, it's hard for him to move his right elbow, so let's stretch his right elbow, let's strengthen his right elbow. We're focusing on what his activity level goal is. A little bit less obvious, but what fits into this is bimanual therapy, and it fits into this. All of these therapies that are involved thinking and doing is the second video here. We're just doing fun activities that are motivating, that involve two hands, and then we're tackling skills that will support these real life activities. So right now he's doing this. He's hammering golf tees into styrofoam. Really cheap activity, really fun for kids. So he's working on keeping his right hand, his elbow extended, his right hand open and stabilizing the object. Yet we're not really working directly on his movement. We're working on the skill of using that right hand while his left hand is using a tool. He's also working on a skill we call orienting objects. You have to figure out how to move these objects in space, how to orient them in order to carry out these motor tasks. Lots of thinking and doing. And then as he progressed over the course of his care, we've looked at ways to make that more difficult. That's another theme of the evidence, is you gradually progress skills. So in the last video here, he's using these like really fine tweezers to orient two different objects, to pick out these little Lego figures from the container to do his Lego activity. So motivating, fun activities, directly practicing these skills. What about themes of ineffective therapies, some of these red light therapies? Well, one, I think, is that they tend to make extraordinary claims, or they're trying to normalize movements, which we just aren't good at yet. If another theme is of the ineffective therapies is that the goals are related to the skill or the activity, but the child is very passive. They're not thinking and doing. The therapist or you as a parent is being told how to do a lot of the work, either by handling them or stretching them. And your child never seems to be actually practicing the goal. You might hear words like, this therapy is based on reflexes or postural reactions or manual therapy. There's a time and a place for that, but not when you're trying to improve skills or participation in the activity. How about this idea of more therapy is always better, right? No, I definitely don't think that's the case. If it feels like your therapist is trying to get rid of you, it's probably not the case, really and truly. All these evidence-based interventions have a beginning and an ending, and then you take a break. You have to practice those skills in real-life situations to make sure that they generalize. In those real-life activities, and as your child explores new hobbies, you'll come up with great new goals that are much more motivating that now you can talk about and do another round of OT or PT. And now you got motivating goals for that next round of therapy. And human motivation just waxes and wanes. So it makes sense to not always be in therapy, always. Um, are intensive programs always better? No, I don't think that's the case. There's a lot of reasons why it seems to be the case when you do an internet search. But the research is telling us that, in short, you do not have to do an intensive program in order to have the same outcomes as non-intensive programs. What is an intensive program? Basically, it's taking the total dose of therapy. If it's 40 hours or 60 hours, it's taking that big dose and jamming it all into like 2 or 3 weeks, as opposed to saying we're going to do it over the course of 2 or 3 months, and we're going to go in with the therapist once or twice, 3 times a week, and we're going to practice every day for 20 minutes in order to come up with that total dose. Either way, you can get good results. So the total dose seems to be more important. Now, that said, I do really like intensive programs. A lot of families really see great results. There is a unique social aspect of it that doesn't get studied. So we can't tell you that, that the science tells you that the social experience is great, but my sense as a therapist is, yeah, it really is. But you can really think about like what's best for your schedule? Is it best to get it all done in 2 weeks, or can we just not do that, or we don't have one in our area and it's too expensive for us to go travel? You don't have to go spend money to do that if it's not accessible to you. And not all intensive programs are created equal. And when someone says it's an intensive program, it doesn't necessarily match what the research tells us really is an intensive program. So don't just go into an intensive knowing that, well, it's intensive, so it must be better. Do you have to do CIMT to get good results? No. That's really important too. Although CIMT was even unknown to a lot of people 15, 20 years ago, now it seems to be like the only thing that you see on the internet. It does work, but so do other interventions. In fact, big Cochrane Library review shows that putting on that restraint has no added value. The results are no better than if you do the same amount of therapy and practice without that restraint and you do bimanual therapy. No difference as far as we can measure. In theory, and it really is just a theory, I think for many cases, especially when the goal is using two hands, the activity involves two hands, we're going to find out when our measurements improve that bimanual therapy, direct practice of two hands is going to have better outcomes. So generally, for most kids, when they are using two hands spontaneously enough, I'll recommend bimanual therapy over constraint. Just know that you don't need to do CIMT in most cases if there's some amount of spontaneous use to begin with. So concluding thoughts, use your parental instincts and values together with these tools, these decision aids, and discussions with your team to make decisions about your goals and your interventions. You should be involved in setting goals and choosing interventions. Thinking and doing seems to be particularly important, and more is not always better. So I don't think we have as much time as I would have liked maybe for questions, but I'm happy to take questions now or even after.
Great. Thank you, Todd. I'm Brian Wishaw. I'm the PD rehab doc that works up here. One thing I was hoping that you could maybe just touch on briefly is just one of the challenges when we look at these types of reviews and these traffic light things in interpreting things. For one, I think when you look at that there's one part that says physical activity is likely not, right? It's on like the low side of not recommended for gross motor in terms of improving function. But when you go back, it's looking at a Cochrane review. When you go back, it's looking at a number of low evidence things, and just some of the challenges with reviews when depending on the level of research that we have. If it's all out of small studies, when we look at, even though you put in a bunch of small studies, if it's poor evidence in, it's not great evidence out, and how you sort of think about that kind of stuff.
Before,
we're talking about, to other
Answer.
people that aren't doing this a lot.
Sorry, before you answer, Todd, can you stop sharing?
Oh,
And I
sure.
just have some housekeeping matters. So we have time for questions until 1:30 or as long as folks can stay. And I encourage you to put questions in the chat or to raise your hand and I'll moderate the chat. So now you can respond. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so it is all it is I think about it at a relativistic kind of point of view. So yeah, on the surface, you look at it's these traffic light reviews are systematic reviews of mostly randomized controlled trials, but I do think it is important to know that these are randomized controlled trials of like 30 kids each, and we're talking about brain injuries that are, everyone's injury is vastly different. These kids, even if the studies are controlling for their age, they're still, you know, very they're still very different. All these kids in the same study are still very different in where they are developmentally. So, relative to like the medications that you're taking, the science is not great, right? And that's important to realize. So it's a relativistic kind of thing, and it's another reason why I like to talk about the themes and kind of like what makes sense to me, not only um, as a therapist who has some knowledge of human performance, but also just like as a person who has hobbies like playing tennis, not really well, but playing tennis, and photography and cooking and like all these things that require all sorts of different types of gross and or fine motor skills. um, a lot of these themes line up with like what's intuitive about that, right? Like um so so I think that's an important way to kind of look at it. It's also, I think, important to um to realize that like some of these things that are yellow especially, um uh they can move up, they can move down too, but historically they have moved up. There's a couple of things. The initial traffic light review for CP came out in 2013. um and there's a couple of things that have moved up from either like low yellow to high, or maybe even yellow to now green. I think co-op is one of them, at least for developmental coordination disorder, where it became green because more studies came out. So sometimes it's not just about um, like there's nothing about it that actually improved. It's just more studies, and because of how the review was done, now it moved up. So I think points well taken. These things are not perfect.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I think that's a great response to it. Thanks.
So a number of you found the slides and suggestions super valuable. We will send out both a link to the recording as well as a couple of handouts that Todd has given me. I'll upload them to the website and have those available. So this will all be available. Um, I'm just scanning for questions. So
Alina, do you want to ask yours directly, or we can read it?
yeah, Alina, if you can come on.
Looks like she was asking, what would be your sports and musical instrument suggestions for hemiplegic children in terms of, maybe from a therapeutic standpoint?
So I think it depends on the the goal, what you're trying to do. So I'll answer that in a couple different ways. Quite broadly, I think motivation is key, regardless of what you're trying to do with the musical activity. So I would generally err towards the side of what instrument is your child most interested in. I generally um, generally don't like to look at um, what activity can we use as a therapeutic intervention. So if you're thinking about how can I get my child to use two hands, I wouldn't necessarily try to think about the activity. There's like a game that I'm sure a lot of you play, and I played at least for the first, say, 15 years of being a therapist, and I have to stop myself. Now it's been like 20 years. I still have to stop myself from playing this game. Is I bet you can't do that using one hand. Guarantee your child can do anything in the world with one hand. um, there's an NFL football player who literally only has one hand. There's been um, two professional baseball players with one hand. I've worked with kids with no hands, and they do um, standardized assessments that I never thought they can do with little pegs. You can't win that game. So try not to look at what activity should I use in order to get them to use two hands. I will say some musical instruments are, I think, more easily adaptable. So percussion is one that I think is relatively really really good when you're trying to adapt it, whether it's using two hands but in an adaptive way where one hand is going to be used, but say we're not going to utilize like finger movements, or we're only going to use one hand. It's easily adaptable. So from that perspective, that's a very adaptable instrument. um,
So I'm going to jump in here. So my 15-year-old plays trombone, and it has their right side affected, but is able to manipulate the slide on the trombone. And it's not a particularly skillful movement with the fine motor, but they have the gross motor that works. And then in terms of sports, I would go back to intrinsic motivation and really try as many sports as you can when the kids are young, which is generally good advice for physical activity as a whole, and see what the child likes to play. So again, my child plays soccer and ice hockey, and they happen to choose goalie for both sports. And in ice hockey, their right hand's affected, so they use their stronger left hand to hold the stick. Um, and we've adapted the mitt, the glove that they catch with over the years with support from an OT, and they're now able to catch. And again, it's a gross motor movement to hold that hand in the mitt, and the position of having the forearm up actually supports pulling the thumb away, which the thumb naturally gets tucked due to their hemiplegia. So try lots and lots of different sports. If the kid is motivated enough, they're going to work really hard to find a way to do it, even if it doesn't look like what you might imagine it looks like.
it's also a matter of values as well. So always thinking about what is it that you and your child, the family at large, value, um, and maybe it's not just like maybe that probably does change day by day, year to year to year, activity to activity. So if the value, say when it comes to we're talking about musical instruments, if the value is participation, to I want to play the instrument the best that I can, and the value is not I want to play it using two hands, or I want to improve my movements through the instrument. If the value is simply I want to play this instrument really well, then the therapeutic technique is goal directed training. It's it's so that it's a research-based intervention, and it's saying, okay, that's the value of the family. And so we're not going to work on hand skills per se. We're going to work on just playing an instrument, and we might use a splint. We might change your position to make you a better player. We might change which hand is doing what. So there's different ways to attack the therapy based on your values, and that's an important thing to bring to the therapy table is what exactly are you trying to do. And that's where, like, we as therapists, including myself, in the moment, we just expect you guys as parents to have your goals. Like we say, oh, what are your goals, right? And we expect you to have that really well thought out, and that's not really reasonable because you don't know all this information about our therapies. You don't really know what we necessarily mean by what are your goals. So I guess one thing I'm trying to do today is to help you take a step back and think about your goals based not only on using two hands, but what are your values for all of these different situations?
Thanks. I want to jump to this question about intensive camps, the all hands on deck camp, but also other camps that anyone on the call is familiar with. The social component, you mentioned there's not much research. Brian and I and Catherine Dimitropoulou at Columbia University, we're actively researching the social emotional benefits of physical activity in a camp context with CP soccer. So that's just one endeavor that's along those domains. Um, but there are intensive camps that are constraint-induced movement therapy camps. There are intensive camps that are cerebral palsy soccer, but there are other intensive camps that many of you might know about. And I know Mary Kay maintains a list on the International Alliance for Pediatric Strokes website. So camp is a great time to explore intensive opportunities.
Can I ask a quick question, Mara?
Sure, Shayla, go ahead.
Todd, the hours that you put in the that one table, does it matter how close together those hours are? Like how consecutive?
Yeah, so that it came from Michelle Jackman is the lead author on this. It's a it's a minimal dosing threshold paper that was published in like 2022, I think it was, and it's it's grouping together a lot of different studies um, to come up with this dose, and um, the best the general guidance is like it doesn't get very specific in terms of like how close do they have to be. So I'm gonna extrapolate a little bit, sort of like just using kind of it probably doesn't matter um, a whole lot when you're most of the studies are looking at either intensive programs, which is that dose being all crammed into 2 to 3 weeks, sometimes four. So say 2 to 4 weeks. And then the other group that it's kind of looking at is this distributed practice. And that's, there's a range, but I would say it's something like 3 months. But it's a big range. And I think the way to, the best way to think about it is it can be a fairly long time, like a few months, so long as that practice, that total dose, is being carried out in some way that makes some sense. So it's like if you say you go to therapy once a week and you don't do your home program, you guys all know what that's like, right? Life happens, and a week goes by, you didn't practice at all, you go back in, and you're back to square one, and you can see it, right? Your child is it's like they have to relearn it again. Maybe it's faster, right? Because they learned it last week, but they have to go back to square one and relearn it again. That's your practice is too far in between. So it probably has to be often enough that you're building on skills. And again, think about your own life. If you're learning a new sport, a new activity, even you, not your child, you want to practice something like a couple of days a week, right? So that you're really building on things and you're not like totally forgetting what happened from one week to the next. So I think as long as practice is somewhat regular and of good quality, then you can space it out. Whether it's intensive 2 to 4 weeks or it's like 3 months, as long as you're really making sure that weeks aren't going by and you're not forgetting what you practiced, you're probably okay.
Mara, Michelle can probably share some of the musical instruments and sports that she's done.
Okay. To go back,
Voluntold.
that's my mom, by the way. To go back to that one a little bit, a lot of great input was already put. But just personally, I played the baritone or the euphonium is the keys middle. So if your kid is right or left hemi, any kid can play it. It was a bit heavy, but someone can help put it on the kid's lap. Um, and then sports, I really do like swimming because you have to think a lot about each side of the body. And it's great for core strength. That might be frustrating for your kid. But I think that might be a really beneficial sport. But that's all I'll say to that, so we can move on to some other questions.
I want to jump to the transcranial direct current stimulation and invite Stuart to answer that if you're able to, Stuart. Jordan, do you want to ask that question?
Sure. Hi, I'm Jordan. I have a 9-year-old with right hemiplegia. So I was wondering about transcranial magnetic, I forget the last word, but I think you know what I'm talking about. The safety, particularly since my son hasn't had a seizure, knock on wood, but he did have a grade 4 bleed of the germinal matrix and 2 clots, bilateral clots. So he's already at a higher risk for seizure. And 2 weeks ago, we just put him on starting on an ADHD stimulant. So that also potentially increases seizure. So just safety in general. And 2, efficacy, especially for like a deeper brain injury, that paired with like the OT. So trying to figure out whether the juice is worth the squeeze.
So I can make a few comments. One is I'm not an MD, so I definitely can't tell you, especially when it comes to a specific concern like seizures. There's a variety of treatments that are considered to be non-invasive brain stimulation. This being one of them. And there's a lot to the definition of what's invasive and what's not. So it's considered non-invasive, but it's physically changing the way that your brain activate, like brain activity. So from a medical point of view, it's considered non-invasive, but know that it is changing the way that your brain is functioning in some way. My non-expert understanding of the research is that the results of the study so far are very, very mixed, and it doesn't give us a very good example of here's how to do it, here's which patients are best for it. Typically, what they're doing is they're stimulating the brain in a certain way to try and optimize learning so that you get more out of the therapy, basically, is like the theory. I think it's really interesting, and I have high hopes for it. But the results in adults are mixed, the results in kids are mixed, and there's fewer studies in kids. So yeah, that would be my non-expert answer.
Thank you.
I can give a name for you. Adam Curtin is a great person to look at his work. He's a pediatric neurologist in Alberta. He's studying this. He's got a number of published studies on the topic, and his lab involves looking at rehab interventions along with these methods of brain stimulation. Yeah.
And Adam will be here with us in our January webinar on January 17th. So come back then and learn from Adam. Okay, there's a specific question from Lori. Do you want to ask that?
I have a 16-year-old daughter who had suffered a stroke when she was 8. And I was just wondering if anyone had any experience with the company is Neurolutions, and they have it's called the Ipsy hand therapeutic kind of hand. It's not necessarily, can potentially be for like teenagers. It's not, I don't think, sized for pediatrics, but I don't know if anyone here has any experience with it at all.
No, except the interactive metronome. I haven't been able to use it too much in my clinic, but that is a really good reaction time. And really, you mentioned this, Todd, like having the kids think about what they're doing. I like that one a lot. And I can go into more detail if anyone's curious about that, but it's almost like tapping to the beat of music or something like that.
I have some experience with devices, Stable Flex being one mechanical device, BioNest being a neuromuscular electrical stimulation device. Um, it the first thing to do is to make sure that the intervention matches the goal and the value. So what is it that you're trying to do? And I don't know what this device is in particular, but there's a lot of different ways to use devices. So one way is as a type of a prosthetic. So the BioNS is one that you can actually use as a type of prosthetic where it's a device you wear in your hand and your forearm, and it's got a muscle stimulator in it that can be programmed so it helps you open and or close the hand, do different patterns of movement. You can use it as a prosthetic in that my goal is to get a better grip on my golf club for a swing. And so that's one sort of way to use it. If your goal is to use it to stimulate muscles and strengthen the muscles, it's a much different goal. And although there's not a lot of research on any particular device, then you can look at the traffic light diagrams and look for, well, where does electrical stimulation fall in the traffic light diagram? And in a nutshell, electrical stimulation can improve strength a little bit, but it really is like, it's not very powerful. So there can be a role for it and a time and a place for it, but I wouldn't expect like really big gains, and especially not gains in function, just by using a device that's going to electrically stimulate the muscles. The other big thought when it comes to devices is the thinking and doing as well. So a lot of people have hopes behind gaming because we know repetition is important, right? It is, and I agree with that. So doesn't it make sense to make all these things games for kids? Well, the pessimistic view there, which I happen to to fall under, I think, is that it really is, the practice can be very different when you're in a gaming environment. So I think your state of mind and your brain processing when you're engaged in a game is not exactly the same as what's happening when you're in real life. And so I don't know if some of the gaming devices are going to end up having what we call a carryover effect. Do they really result in improvements in real life activities? So far, most of the devices that I've read about are really small studies, and the measures that they use in the studies to decide do they work or not are really not like measures that you would expect to reflect real life activities. So even the studies that show, oh, they seem to be helping, they're not like great real life measures. That's not to say like don't ever use these devices, but I think they don't really fall under the themes of the evidence of like the green light and the high yellows. So it's like maybe you look at it as, boy, we've tried a bunch of the greens and the high yellows. And we're done with them. They haven't worked, or they've worked, but we've reached a point where they're not working anymore. Or you're just super motivated by it. Maybe you try it and if you've got the resources and hey, it may not be proven effective. Maybe you try it anyway and see does it work for you. I think in one of the traffic light studies, Ayana Novak and colleagues, the way that they worded some of the discussion was, the yellow is one way to think about the yellows is take extra detail, extra attention at measuring, is it working for you? Because if it's a yellow because the studies aren't showing that it's working for a lot of people, doesn't mean that it doesn't work for a few people. So you can kind of get a sense, is it working for you?
Thanks. I want to take a question from Maria and then a couple from Jordan, and then we'll wrap up. Maria, can you ask your question?
Yes, sure. Hello, I want to know if the size of the affected arm can improve with therapy or it just will be shorter for the rest of his life. Thank you.
I get that question a lot, and I honestly don't know. I don't know if I have a great answer for you. I can tell you that it's a common issue and a common question. I can tell you that I think it is with with therapy, particularly therapy that is aimed at improving muscle strength, um, and not just therapy, physical activity, physical activity in general, particularly strengthening activities. I think it's reasonable to believe that you can get the muscles aren't so atrophied that the muscles are still firing. They're working to an extent that you can get muscle growth sufficient to expect a change in the girth of the muscle. I don't know if that would translate to length. Um, I've been needing to talk about this with some of my physical medicine and rehab doctors, and I know that there's one place you might want to look at is there's some research going on. I think it's mostly in the lower extremity, looking at vibration plates, where kids are standing on vibration plates. And they're looking at bone density. And there's some, I think, pretty decent research there that shows improved bone density. And I don't know if that research has shown improved leg length or muscle growth. There's some electrical stimulation literature in the quadriceps muscle that show if you embed the study embedded a needle into the muscle for like a few months. So it was a lot of electrical stimulation. It's not like the E-stim units that you take home. You can grow the quadriceps muscle. So that's why I say, like with E-stim, you really have to do a lot to expect any sort of a change. So I think when you're trying to grow muscle, it really has to be the kind of exercise that you would expect for any human to get stronger and grow muscle. So it's pretty intensive exercise. I do think about like sports medicine, physical therapy for some kids with hemiparesis. I think at some point it makes sense to reach out to a sports medicine PT, or an OT who. So some OTs are hand therapists and have experience in like sports medicine, and say, hey, would you be able to help me adapt like a physical strength training routine to really do some intensive muscle strengthening, to the point that I could expect muscle growth. Do you have experience with hemiparesis to do that? I think you probably will find some therapists that can do that.
And outside of therapists, you also might find um, personal trainers. So there are CrossFit trainers who specifically work with populations of kids and adults who have neurological injuries. And that's a great resource. The other thing is, depending on the age of the child, playgrounds are very sort of fundamentally bimanual. So climbing walls, all kinds of things that encourage kids to hang, contribute to this stretching and tensile use of both arms. And you really have to use both arms or you're going to fall off from many of these structures. So that's another approach. Michelle, did it look like you
Thank
want to
you.
share something?
Yeah, pretty much what you said, Mara. That's what I do now is more like I go to the gym and actually do weightlifting. And I do rock climbing and I cycle, and I've noticed a change in my body. I'm like, oh, I'm filling out my jeans more now. So, um, doing more actual physical activity and um going to the gym, if that's something that your kid or teenager wants to do, you can definitely see a difference in the girth, like Todd mentioned. I also can't give you much insight in terms of the growth or the length of the muscle.
I do want to say one more thing, which is as a parent of a child who has uh, limb length difference due to hemiplegia, I think that if we, as the parents, can focus more on function in supporting our children. It's really supportive of whole child development. I've seen in the clinic, because I attend the pediatric stroke clinic, that when parents are very worried about the visible appearance and maybe less worried about the functional use, it's detrimental to self-esteem. So if there's any way that you can shift your mindset to focus on function over appearance, that's really, really helpful.
Self-esteem and rock wall climbing. I often recommend rock wall climbing. I've seen a lot of kids with hemiparesis. We used to have access to a rock wall in our intensive program, and just what it would do for self-esteem and like getting over fear of a new activity, amazing. It has the potential of engaging a lot of different muscle groups that are very hard to engage without very specific, very boring exercises, particularly intrinsic hand muscles. Really hard for a therapist to improve for a patient. You're going to have a much better chance of doing that with a non-therapist in rock wall climbing than you will with me. So the idea of using activities that don't necessarily involve a therapist, there's really good opportunities to do that as long as you're comfortable with the coach, the teacher, whoever it is, and you're usually strapped in and locked into a harness with rock wall climbing. So generally, quite a lot of safety there.
Thanks. I want to wrap up, but Jordan, do you want to ask one of your questions and then we'll wrap up?
Oh, it's up to you which one I have so many.
Well, there's the Botox with OT, or what was another one?
So like all the functional OT intensives that I dream of.
Yeah, I don't know of those. You got some brainstorming in there. How about the Botox with OT?
Sure. Specifically for intensive, but I guess regularly as well. I was wondering how you feel about that. We had a bad experience when my son was like 5 or 6, where it was over Botox and he just lost so much function and it wasn't helpful. It was also right before COVID, so we didn't get any of the therapeutic benefits. So we're just really worried about that. He's older now, he's 9, but it was just such a scarring time for him also to lose all that function that he had worked so hard overnight, or but it could be beneficial, right? He's got a lot of up and down the upper extremity.
Yeah, I mean, I think Botox is certainly a tool that can be used in a variety of different ways. When it's used if the goal is to improve the cosmetic appearance of an upper extremity posture, then you don't even necessarily need to have an OT or a PT involved.
No, this would be for more function, more range.
Mm-hmm. If it's for function, it's pretty clear that it should be timed well with OT. It's tricky to do that. You have to time. It's tricky to do that. Long story short, it's possible. Sometimes it seems to make a lot of sense. It's not so clear that it's just like so much better that you should just do it. So it depends very much on the case. And in terms of it, it has a transient effect. So on the bright side of the transient effect is if it doesn't work or if it has a negative effect, it's out of your system in like 3 months. So that's the bright side. But what about your experience? It can be a downside, right? So that's good food for thought. I think a lot of physicians and therapists probably don't think that there is a downside there. They just say, hey, just try it. If it doesn't work, it wears off. Well, what if that really is discouraging, right? Or those 3 months can be a big deal. So I'm glad you brought that up. To my knowledge, it hasn't been studied directly in the context of intensive programs. The timing in order to do that is very difficult to get a group of kids done. I'm interested in that, and I'm also interested in the upper extremity surgeries together with a skill-based intensive program. That I know, I've really looked for that in the literature, and I can't find it. And that's really hard to time, to get all those surgeries done, to have to test a big enough group to do that and then do an intensive program. So I hope we look at that in the future. Yeah, I hope that helps.
Thank you.
Thanks. I saw that Stuart came on camera. I just want to give you a chance, Stuart, to answer Jordan's previous question about TMS, as well as if you want to chime in on the limb length difference in kids and affected by hemiplegia.
Yeah, sure. I'm sorry, I missed the question. Unfortunately, I had to take a patient call. Which question was it? And am I still muted? No, I'm not.
Jordan was asking about risks,
Of T
particularly if there's potential for seizure
That's a
vulnerability.
really good question. So for TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, where they're using a magnetic, they call it a wand, to try to cause nerve cells to discharge or fire, and it actually does. You can make someone's arm move. There is a theoretical risk for seizure. I don't know exactly what the number is, but I believe it has been reported. For TDCS, transcranial direct current stimulation, that is using a much smaller electric signal, and it's using direct current. It's typically between 1 and 4 milliamps, and in kids, I don't think anyone's gone above 2 milliamps that I know of. And as far as we can tell for that, in the hundreds of sessions that have been done, including on kids that have epilepsy, including in our studies, no one's ever had a seizure, and we don't know of any increased risk of seizure with TDCS.
Thanks. And then the other question was, um, is it sort of fundamental that when there's a strong hemiparesis that there'll be a limb length difference? And is that something that therapeutic intervention can address, and at what stage, how?
I don't think I know the answer to that question. The kids that we see have all been childhood onset stroke for our research studies anyway, and that hasn't been a concern as much that we run into. So I am not sure, though I think maybe I'll have to check that out.
Okay. Thanks so much to everyone for coming, to Michelle and Todd for sharing your expertise. And I'll follow up with a survey, and we'll follow up perhaps next week with the handouts that Todd shared with me once I get them uploaded to the website, and also with the recording from today's session. We'll look forward to seeing you next month with Adam Curtin for more about neuro rehab and in the coming months. Thanks so much.